Hi everyone, so 2 nights ago we had the patch notes update for Season 9. At least most of the patch notes are in here. We don't have the class changes just yet, besides the unique item changes, but there's a bunch of other stuff in here. I'm not going to reiterate everything about Season 9 just now. I'm going to have like an actual Season 9 guide and these kind of things up very soon. Just as a little refresher, when you might have forgotten this or you have not really seen it yet, we are getting some updates to the game here, in particular the Nightmare Dungeon escalation system, which is effectively like a series of kind of like harder and harder Nightmare Dungeons with the Astaroth fight at the end. There's like a lot of like reward updates in the Nightmare Dungeons as well, new affixes and so on. Then we're gonna get some season powers. So this is kind of a combo of something like the vampire powers from Season 2, and the like jewels from Season 7, for example, with the witchcraft. So it's somewhere on that level. You have like these unique jewels and some other powers you can choose, and you can like create your own skill with a bunch of different combos you can do. So that's kind of like the TLDR here, and of course a bunch of new unique items that actually have been changed now and that we can talk about. So I'm gonna go through this here and give my thoughts on it, and then of course on Friday we have the campfire chat, including all of the class changes, the full patch notes. I'll have a follow-up on that, and then we can get ready for Tuesday on the 1st of July when the season actually goes live. And as always, we're also gonna update everything on Maxwell. So let's just jump into this right away, and we see here these blue annotations of like what has changed, so we can kind of quickly identify this. There's a bunch of like small stuff, like some numbers changes on like some of the season powers and so on, but there are also some kind of mechanical impactful changes here that I want to go through. One of them is, for example, here we have a longer duration on the deactivation effects of certain elite affixes. Previously, you actually had to choose certain color lists in order to actually have this effect permanent, and now this is actually much more consistent with an 8 seconds timer on all of these here. So it allows you to be more flexible with what you choose and how often you apply those effects, and it's going to be felt at least. Then you have a bunch of arcana changes. Most importantly, the sharpening gizmo. This is kind of like a topic that people talk about, but I don't think this is really that impactful, to be honest. Like this effect where you can consume the dots and deal damage instantly is just not really that impactful. Like, you know, some classes like Spurborn don't want to use this because they already have Noxious Resonance, which is just the same but 1,000 times better. And then other classes, let's say Sorcs with the new Hydra build, for example, that's going to be pretty hype and strong. You don't really want to do this here because you actually deal less damage if you don't burn the targets continuously. So it doesn't really leave like a lot of options, and I thought about this a little bit. And the only thing where I consider this to be maybe a downside is something like Blight Necro or so. Maybe there's a few other builds out there, but realistically, I don't think this is really a big deal, to be honest. So I wouldn't really worry about this. Another relatively big change though is that they changed the propulsion infinite jump combo. So that was a thing that you might have seen on the PTR where people made these like infinite teleport builds. This was a combo with like one of the catalysts that formed these mana blasts, and then there was like another arcana where you can like blink to that blast, and then you had the reset effect here from the bloody charm. So this allowed you to kind of like get the explosion, kill a target, and that kill resets the cooldown, and then it kind of like chain reacts and you like zap around with the blink. So this was kind of wild, but on the other hand, incredibly weak and incredibly inconsistent, and honestly, I tried it, not very fun. So kind of good riddance in my book, and you actually just have to make like typical, you know, like real speed farming builds now anyway. And especially with the inconsistency, it just didn't really feel great, to be honest. So I hear people kind of like moaning that this was changed and the fun police has stepped in, but realistically, I don't think that this is really like a huge impact because of also like the low damage of this effect. So you have to kill stuff with the season power and not with your own skills in order for this to work. And then you could very easily kind of break this chain reaction, and then you would just like stand there for like 5 seconds and would have to wait for the cooldown. So this is kind of like how that worked actually. And yeah, like some of those clips you might have seen, those were kind of like the, you know, the good scenarios, but you didn't really see the bad scenarios. So this is just what I can say about this. And yeah, I think that's probably a change for the better. Then we also have a bunch of changes to the Heric Jewels here. So first of all, there's a new jewel, the Willbreaker, which is for physical builds. So there is, for example, an elemental based gem here, the Scornful Light, which is very powerful, that goes into many builds. And now they also made the physical one, which gives you a 40% physical damage boost for 6 seconds the first time you hit an enemy or when you CC them. So I assume this works when you stagger a boss, because this mentions here the boss and when they are affected by crowd controls. So you're gonna have like some pretty nice burst early on physical builds. There's definitely some builds out there that will benefit from this. You know, a bunch of stuff on the bar potentially, a bunch of stuff on the rogue, even necros and so on. So there's a few builds that might want to run this, especially for farming, because they have like a very low uptime, but it's a pretty strong effect here. It's like kind of the strongest gem out there, roughly. They also buffed the minion gem here, so that is a bit surprising because minions are already looking very strong. Like on the barb, we have the minion barb, we have the minion necro, that is also getting another buff from its unique, and we have companion druid. So yeah, the minions are everywhere. Even like the shadow clone on the rogue, for example, is you know, very prevalent in many builds, and they're buffing this. This is a bit surprising because most of these builds were actually pretty top tier already, but it's, you know, kind of like a small buff here, and the uptime is not the greatest anyway, so that is fine. And kind of like bigger change, at least for the hardcore enjoyers, the cheat def is removed from hardcore, so this just cannot drop in hardcore. To be honest, I think that's a good change. I generally am not a fan of cheat def mechanics at all, so this should not really creep into the game like that, I think. But another bigger change is idle from below. This kind of went into every single build on the PTR, mainly because it just has like an okay range of stats, and it gives you unhindered, which is kind of nice, you know, especially on classes that don't otherwise have a lot of mobility. For example, the necros really love this. And you can kind of just walk through enemies, which is always a really strong effect because you can position yourself better, you can dodge, and so on. So this is very useful, and it also spawned these extra so-called jewel guardians. So these are just like extra elites that pop up once in a while. So especially in the pit where you try to progress and, you know, fill the bar, sometimes you just get like extra elites, and they actually also give you progress. So that was kind of like the biggest deal here. And also, you know, many builds, for example, on the boss fight in the pit, would benefit from having more targets present, and then you deal more damage because you suddenly, you know, can, you know, maybe get more procs or something like that against many targets instead of only one target. So this was just generally a very useful gem, although those Jewel Guardians were really dangerous as well. So they are, they have like some special affixes, and they really wreck you. So that is another thing to keep in mind, especially on hardcore. But yeah, now this has been made a bit more consistent, so I'm not sure what this means exactly with the specific intervals, but I guess maybe there's like, you know, maybe every 2 minutes or something, or every 3 minutes, maybe there's like an elite pack popping up, and, you know, you get a bunch of free loot, or you get a bunch of free progression, and you know, that might just help you out. So I think this is going to remain a pretty important and impactful jewel here. Then a Spark of Creation, a small nerf on the resource generation. Doesn't really matter, I feel. It's kind of nice, you know, to like solve your resources early on. I actually used that a little bit to, you know, try some stuff on the PDR, but it's effectively like an early game choice. And yeah, it was kind of strong, to be honest, at 10, so that's probably fine. Then we have a bunch of updates here on the Nightmare Dungeon escalation stuff in the strong rooms. Most importantly, they reduced the timer to 100 seconds, which I think is good. I suggested actually a 1-minute timer. It was 2 minutes on the PTR, and I felt that was way too long for this, like, you know, little side event effectively that you do inside of the Nightmare Dungeon. So it's just kind of like a bit more fast paced. There's a bit more action the way it sounds like. So that's kind of cool. And they also added more bosses because there was only one boss that always popped up, which was Blood Bishop. And maybe we also get Tomb Lord now, who knows? So we'll see. But yeah, at least it seems like they did a bit of tweaking here that made that a little bit more interesting. Also, another cool novelty here is that we're gonna get like a permanent buff for the rest of the dungeon after finishing these strong rooms. So either get XP or rep or the files, gold or Opticide. So you get a bunch of, you know, something basically. Like, we don't know like how impactful that really is. For example, XP, I don't really believe that's gonna be a big deal, but who knows? Maybe they really give you like some juicy chunk of XP, and this might be an alternative to, for example, farming paragons in the pit, but we'll have to wait and see. Another nice addition here is also that Astaroth, which is at the end of the Nightmare Dungeon escalation sigil run. You now also have a chance to get Heric Jewels just by themselves. Usually you would have to like find the tome that gives you like the recipe, and then you can craft it. We didn't actually get to try this on the PDR because the seasonal quest line was not present there, so I'm not 100% sure how this works. But I guess it's a bit like Season 7 with the witchcraft stuff, where you probably have like some kind of NPC or, you know, some, you know, crafting station or something like that, and you bring the recipe and then you know, craft it there basically. So you can now also just get a jewel right away from doing Nightmare Dungeons. So I do expect that these Nightmare Dungeon runs and the escalation stuff is going to be pretty important, especially early on in the progression. So when you go into tournament difficulties for the first time, you're probably going to try to do some Nightmare Dungeons. You know, you can farm up a bunch of items there, you can farm a bunch of like boss mods like Distilled Fear, and you know, eventually get a bunch of those sigils here. And then you have your first season powers online, and you can focus on other stuff afterwards. So this is kind of how I expect that to go. And it's kind of cool that we can just get these jewels here. And another big advantage is these jewels have the same value of armor and res as skulls and diamond. It's like split between the two values, but the total is the same as a grand version of skulls or diamonds, basically. So usually you have, you know, kind of like a shortage of gem fragments. But now, if you have Heric Jewels, they will have the full, you know, grand gem value from the start. So this will just like progress. So this will make progressing through the tournament tiers much easier because you have much more res, much more armor, and you don't have to worry that much about getting gem fragments to actually craft those grand gems as fast as possible. There's also a bunch of new Nightmare Dungeon affixes that we have not seen yet, but here's, for example, this screenshot here. They also made it like legendary sigils now. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be like also magic or rare sigils or something, or if just like escalation sigils are just legendary now and that's it. So I think that might be it. But there's also like this hunter's affix now that we have not seen. Explosive elites, I'm not sure if that was a thing. But yeah, it seems like they added a bunch more stuff that could make it a bit interesting here. And I'm not really sure what to expect. This might be a bit like the Bloodseekers maybe from season 2 or so when I think about hunters. But it sounds fun, and I hope we're gonna get some cool stuff there. Now let's talk about the unique item changes here. So we have the Barbarian Hooves of the Mountain God. That's like the new basic attack pair of boots, which was relatively nice. Now we're not really gonna see like a big meta shift on the barb, and you know, this change is like a relatively minor change that didn't really like giga buff the basic attacks now or something like that. But especially Lunging Strike was really good as like a Torment 4 farming build. It doesn't really have like crazy DPS, but in Torment 4 you get to the point where you basically one-shot everything and you are flying. So I'm definitely going to play that, and that's going to be really good. You can also play with the other basic attacks, and there might be maybe some other buffs or some other tweaks for basic attacks in there, but just having like a larger cleave radius is definitely going to feel good. And I will also cover this in like a guide video for the like especially Lunging Strike barb, which is something that I found very fun. So I'm looking forward to that, and this seems like a nice little tweak here to just help it out a bit. But the TLDR is Barbarian is still like an Earthquake dominated class. So we have the minion barb with the Earthquakes, we have like the Leap Quake stuff, we have the Whirlwind Earthquake. You know, there's a bunch of different combos all based on Earthquake, and at least so far nothing is really changing about that. And I also don't really expect a major shift here because the Earthquakes are so far ahead of all the other stuff on the barb. Like, you know, multiple times ahead, like dozens of times in terms of like damage output, or hundreds of times even stronger. And on the other hand, they can't really nerf the Earthquakes right now because Barb is already kind of like middle of the pack. You know, it's like a decent class with those top end builds, but you know, I don't really see them nerfing Earthquakes, but I also don't know how they would just randomly buff the other stuff to like a power level of like Pit 100 plus, for example. So we're not going to see that, but yeah, we might see some really cool like speed farming builds, especially based around this. Then we have the Druid. This is actually a pretty big update, and in fact, they almost one-to-one took exactly the suggestions I gave them. So I actually made a video about this, and I also wrote some stuff on like the partner Discord and so on, and it seems like they really liked my ideas. So when I tried this polarized thing here of the Rotting Lightbringer, it was kind of like a very clunky and not really powerful choice. So I tried with this weapon and without this weapon, and it felt a little bit like a side grade, but just not as fun, you know, kind of like inconsistent. And now they have really buffed this thing up. So I think it's going to be a pretty strong choice now. I don't think it's going to be like, you know, like necessarily S tier or like, you know, one of the best builds out there, but it's going to be solid at the very least. It's definitely something that makes me excited to play a Druid. And yeah, basically what happens now is that we're going to get a lot more power from this unique weapon. So previously, I mentioned the inconsistency. You had like, for example, a 10-second cooldown, but only a 6-second uptime. And for example, you had like an overpower that could snapshot into the puddle, but then it didn't always do that because of, you know, random timings and so on. And then you didn't have that, and suddenly the pool did nothing. So now they made it consistent, and every polarize can form a puddle, so you can kind of always spawn it where you need it. They gave it like a guaranteed overpower for its own effects, which is also really nice because, you know, when you overpower, you deal damage. When you don't overpower, you can't kill anything. So this is really good to kind of, you know, give it like a good flow, a good, you know, like consistent output here. And they also buffed the numbers, and they made the pool longer, and you can now have multiple of them, and then you can splash all of them. So yeah, I'm really excited to try this out. I think it's going to be very fun and pretty strong. But that being said, Druid in general is just kind of like on the bottom, I'd say, for like the overall class performance. There is the Flesh Render Druid, which is like the old like so-called Singer Druid, but these days I think that's played with Bulwark. That has cleared above pit 100 on the PTR, but it's also like a very unusual and kind of weird build that I don't expect a lot of people to necessarily like very much. But Polarize, on the other hand, it might not be exactly on that power level, but I think it's going to be pretty strong. And we have to see exactly the mechanics. How many pools can you actually have? It will depend a little bit on that, since we have not actually seen this in action yet. Then we have the Necromancer. So they changed the gloves and buffed them a little bit. Previously, it looked like to me like you were able to choose between the old school minion playstyle and this with only the mages. And now it's kind of like, you know, skewing a bit more towards mages. So it seems like this is just like what they want you to do. At some point, you go for the Hand of Nas, and for example, here you have twice as many like AoE attacks basically from those mages, which is kind of a big deal. So you just have much better clear, and you also have the Unstoppable here, and they look a bit different. Yeah, overall, the minion necro is really strong. So I think on the PTR, that was already like in the range of like pit 100 or so. It's pretty chill, pretty easy. You know, it's like for minion enjoyers, this is a really strong build. And there's also other good stuff on a Necromancer. So Necromancer also has a really high power level across the board with the typical suspects with Blood Wave, Bone Spear, the minions, and yeah, Bone Spirit as well. So there's a bunch of stuff. Then we have the Rogues. The Rogues have this Flurry Helm here, which is missing the blue color, but they basically reduce the drain a little bit, and they buff the damage a little bit. And that will make it noticeably better than Air of Perdition now. So previously it was kind of a side grade, maybe slightly better, but now it's like clearly the Flurry Helm basically. And the main advantage really is that it's much easier to get this item than it is to get an Air of Perdition. So you don't have to go for that mythic anymore, and you can, you know, spend your runes on, you know, other items, or you can try to, you know, craft one of the other mythics or farm one of the other mythics instead of the Air of Perdition now. So that's kind of like the main advantage here. And it's also slightly more defensive because it actually has, you know, life, it has armor that Perdition doesn't have, for example. Other than that, I mean, Flurry Rogue is pretty strong. It is also going to push like somewhere in like the 90 plus range, and it's a very fast build, very good for farming. And it's actually one of those rogue builds that kind of works well with the Shadow Clone AI as well. So there's that. And I think Flurry is going to be fine. But that being said, Death Trap is definitely the clear winner on the Rogue. So even if you want to do this here, you have to keep in mind that this is weaker and, you know, just not as crazy as Death Trap is. Even with the nerfs, the overpower, and some other stuff that has happened to Death Trap, that remains at the top, at least from what you can tell so far. Then we have an update here for the Sorcerer Hydra Amulet. So Hydra is looking like one of the top builds out there as well. It's definitely on the Sorg, but in general, this is going to be a very good build, very fast build. Also pretty chill. In general, we have like a pretty big like minion season, to be honest. You know, we have the barbs with the minion stuff, we have the necros, we have the sorgs, we have yeah, the rogues with the shadow clone on many builds. So yeah, here's just another example. And they are changing both the crit buffs here to be more generic now. So previously I tried this, for example, on the PTR as like a crit build, but that was way weaker than the burn version, and I've actually since then reworked my planner to a burn version for this build, which was already stronger, and now the gap is just like widening a bit. So Hydra is a burn build now, and period. So this is just what you need to know here. So they added attack speed, they added Primordial Binding, which is like an insanely strong passive to add. So overall it's going to help the Hydra Sorg a little bit, but you also have to keep in mind that they will probably remove one of the Hydras that they were able to cast, because there was a bug with the Serpentine aspect that allowed you to have an extra Hydra out. That is the current effect, but was not removed from the reworked version of that aspect. So we're going to probably lose one of the 3 Hydras, but we gain this and potentially other tweaks. Overall though, this will not really hurt the build if they fix that bug, because we got a bunch of changes here and it is very strong, also pretty solid. I just found it not as enticing to play in like a push version, because it's relatively slow paced and you don't really do much. But for farming, it's kind of cool. You use teleport, Hydra, you know, stuff it just works basically. And I think a lot of people would like this. And then you have the Spiritborn here. So Spiritborn got a 50% nerf for their new item here. So the Balazan's Master Lattle, the unique pants here that are based on thorns and poison damage. And I gotta say, that is fine. Like, Spiritborn is looking like by far the strongest class. And it will depend a little bit on if they're gonna fix the Jaguar Hull double dipping, which may or may not happen. But since they have just nerfed these pants, I actually don't expect that fix to happen. At least not in Season 9, maybe later on, because it would kind of like ripple through the entire class and a lot of stuff would really fall off suddenly if they do that without like other tweaks. So I did give some suggestions to the devs about what they could do, especially if they decide to do that double dipping change. But right now, seeing this here, I don't expect that to happen. So this means that Spiritborn is most likely going to be an undisputed king when it comes to pit pushing, and overall just a very good class in Season 9, because there's plenty of builds that are extremely fast, really good at Torment 4 farming and XP farming and all that. You have a very good early progression, you're fast throughout the entire journey basically. And I do expect a lot of Spiritborns in Season 9, especially with those new pants, also giving it a lot of endgame power and potentially pushing into like the 115, 120 pit range or something like that. And that was also pretty much it for the changes here. We have the updated like loot tables here as well, so we can also see that where like all new items drop. We also have like the loot table like cheat sheet here for the Maxwell page, so we're gonna add that of course, so you can find what you're looking for. And here's a bunch of information about the reliquary and the battle pass. You can, for example, get this nice little goat here. I do like this one, but this is part of the paid battle pass. But pretty cool at least. And a little more info here. There's also a free pet that you can get, which is this guy here from the season journey. Good boy, Dante, he's called. And there's also like, other cosmetics that they're introducing here and so on. So this is what we got here for now for the Season 9 update, and I try to give like my thoughts. I just spent a few hours yesterday kind of going through everything, updating my planners, thinking about what are the changes really going to do, and I hope I could present that properly here. So stay tuned for the campfire chat on Friday. I'll be live streaming that of course, and then I will have follow-up videos. I have planned a lot of guides, a lot of builds that I want to put out for this season launch, because I have played all of the classes on the PTR. I have prepared a bunch of builds here, so you're gonna see me make probably at least one video per class, probably multiple on the Spiritborn in the next few days. So stay tuned for that. For now, hope you enjoyed this here, and I'll see you guys next time.